It was a quiet afternoon in Bellaire, Ohio on May 7th, 2017. The small, blue-collar town sat on the banks of the Ohio River, a place where neighbors knew one another and crime was rare. But that evening, a horrifying discovery would shatter that sense of safety. Stay with me as we unravel the real truth. Welcome to Fatal Affairs, a channel solely focused on bringing daily told and untold crime cases on love, betrayal, and revenge. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your unwavering support, and please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for future updates. We would really appreciate that. David Kinney, a 31-year-old married man, arrived at his friend Brad McGarry's house. But he wasn't alone. He had brought his wife and stepdaughter along. When they stepped inside, they were met with a grisly scene. Lying face down in the basement was Brad McGarry, his body still, blood pooling beneath his head. He had been executed, shot twice in the back of the head at close range. The brutality of the murder shocked even the responding officers, but the real mystery was yet to unfold. Brad McGarry was well known in the community. A friendly, hard-working man, he had lived openly as a gay man in a town that wasn't always accepting. He had his fair share of struggles, but was loved by those who truly knew him. And among those people was David Kinney, his best friend. Or so everyone believed. At first, Kinney appeared devastated. He clung to his wife, seemingly in shock. He told the police he had come to check on Brad after not hearing from him all day. But as detectives started piecing together the timeline, inconsistencies in Kinney's story began to surface. His alibi was shaky, his emotions seemed forced, and there was something about his presence at the crime scene that just didn't sit right. The crime scene itself told its own story. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing that indicated a robbery gone wrong. Brad had known his killer. He had trusted them enough to turn his back on them, unaware that death was just inches away. The police immediately began questioning those closest to Brad. Friends described him as generous and kind, but they also mentioned his longing for love. He had struggled with relationships in the past, often falling for the wrong people. He had confided in some that he was seeing someone new, but he had kept the details private. It was a secret relationship, one that no one knew much about, and that secret would soon become the center of the investigation. As investigators dug deeper, a name kept surfacing in Brad's phone records and messages: David Kinney. They had been in frequent contact, more than just two casual friends. Detectives began to wonder, could this best friend be more than just a grieving acquaintance? Was there something between them that no one else knew about? The breaking point came when the police reviewed Brad's social media. Hidden in his messages was an intimate exchange between him and Kinney. The texts revealed a relationship that went far beyond friendship. But there was one problem. Kinney was married to a woman. He had built his life around the image of a family man, yet he was hiding a part of himself. The discovery changed everything. The police now had a motive: fear and exposure. Kinney had everything to lose if his secret relationship with Brad came to light. A possible affair, a double life. Could these be the driving forces behind the murder? Investigators knew they needed to confront Kinney directly. They called him in for questioning, and what followed was one of the most bizarre and revealing interrogations they had ever conducted. At first, he maintained his innocence, claiming he had no idea who would hurt Brad. But as detectives pushed him with evidence, his story began to shift. First, he said he had last seen Brad days ago. Then, he admitted he had been there the same day but left before anything happened. Finally, he confessed that they had an argument. But Kinney's confessions were layered in half-truths. Detectives could see he was unraveling, struggling to keep up with his own lies. And then, in a moment of desperation, he changed his story again. This time, claiming he had been present when Brad was murdered, but that someone else had pulled the trigger. It was a last-ditch effort to deflect blame, but the investigators weren't buying it. By the end of the first interrogation, Kinney had implicated himself multiple times. His timeline was falling apart, and the evidence against him was growing stronger by the hour. As police prepared their next steps, they knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal, and they were getting closer to proving that David Kinney had something to hide, something deadly. As the investigation into Brad McGarry's murder continued, the pressure on David Kinney began to mount. The crime scene had told its own silent story. There was no forced entry, no signs of struggle, and nothing had been stolen. Whoever had killed Brad had done so with precision and intent, execution style, and the evidence was beginning to point in only one direction. The interrogation room was cold, the fluorescent lights humming softly above as Kinney sat across from detectives. He maintained his innocence, at least at first. His initial statement was simple. He had gone to Brad's house that evening with his wife and stepdaughter, only to find his best friend murdered. But as detectives pushed harder, the cracks in his alibi widened. One of the first major inconsistencies was Kinney's timeline. He had told police he hadn't seen Brad that day, but phone records proved otherwise. Surveillance footage from a gas station near Brad's house also showed Kinney's truck driving through the area at a time that directly contradicted his claims. "Why did you tell us you hadn't seen him?" one detective asked, leaning in, his eyes locked onto Kinney's. I guess I forgot," Kinney stammered, his fingers twitching slightly on the table. But the investigators weren't buying it. They had already retrieved more damning evidence: Brad's text messages. In those messages, Brad had been expecting Kinney that day. They had made plans to meet up, just like they had done many times before. But now Brad was dead, and Kinney was the last known person to have seen him alive. The detectives let the silence stretch, letting Kinney stew in his own lies before one of them spoke again. "You told us you didn't see Brad that day, but your phone shows you texted him just before you got to his house, and the security footage doesn't lie." Kinney swallowed hard, his gaze shifting to the table. Okay, maybe I did see him," he admitted. "But I swear, when I left, he was fine." Detectives weren't satisfied. They pressed further. Kinney's story was changing, but he was still leaving something out, something big. As police continued their investigation, they uncovered something unexpected. Kinney and McGarry's relationship wasn't just a casual friendship, it was something much deeper. Friends of Brad had already hinted that he had been involved in a secret romantic relationship, but they hadn't known with whom. Now detectives had their answer. Phone records, text messages, and private conversations painted a picture of a hidden relationship between the two men, one that Kinney had desperately tried to keep secret. Kinney was married. He had built a life as a devoted husband and stepfather, living what seemed like a conventional family life. But his relationship with Brad threatened to unravel everything. If the truth came out, his world would come crashing down. And perhaps Brad had started to realize that. One of Brad's friends would later tell investigators that Brad had been frustrated. He wanted Kinney to acknowledge their relationship, but Kinney refused. Was it possible that an argument over this had led to murder? With this new information, detectives had a motive: fear. Fear of exposure, fear of losing his marriage, fear of his secret life being revealed. If Brad had threatened to tell Kinney's wife or anyone else about their relationship, Kinney would have had everything to lose. With this new evidence in hand, detectives brought Kinney back for further questioning. This time, they confronted him with what they knew. "We know about you and Brad," one detective said bluntly, sliding a stack of text message transcripts across the table. Kinney's face drained of color. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, avoiding their gaze. "Come on, David. We have the messages. We have witnesses. We know what was going on between you two." For the first time, Kinney looked genuinely panicked. He had worked so hard to keep his life compartmentalized, and now, piece by piece, it was falling apart. "You don't understand," he finally whispered. "I had no choice." Those 4 words sent a chill through the room. No choice? What did that mean? Detectives pressed further, but Kinney clammed up. It was clear he was hiding something, but now it was no longer a question of if he was involved, it was a question of how. As they continued to corner him, Kinney's story began to unravel completely, and soon they would get the truth, a truth darker than anyone could have imagined. David Kinney sat across from the detectives, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white from the pressure. The room was silent, except for the hum of the overhead lights. He had dodged and deflected their questions for hours, but now, with mounting evidence against him, he was running out of ways to explain himself. "David," one detective began, his voice calm but firm, "we know you were with Brad the day he was killed. We know about your relationship. What we don't know is why. Why did this happen?" Kinney's face was a mixture of exhaustion and panic. He took a deep breath, his gaze flickering between the 2 detectives, searching for an escape, but there was none. "I didn't do it," he muttered. But his voice lacked conviction. He was crumbling. The lies start to unravel. At this point in the interrogation, detectives had already caught Kinney in multiple lies. His timeline was inconsistent. His claims of last seeing Brad days before the murder had been disproven by phone records and surveillance footage. But the biggest crack came when investigators presented him with the messages between him and Brad. "You told us you weren't in contact with Brad that day," one detective said, sliding the printed text messages across the table. "Then why does he text you just hours before he was killed? Why did you say you were coming over?" Kinney's breathing grew uneven. He licked his lips, his mind racing for another way out, another excuse, but there were none left. I was there, okay?" he finally admitted. "I was at his house, but I didn't kill him." A shaky confession. The detectives leaned in. This was the break they had been waiting for. "Tell us what happened, David," one of them urged. "Tell us the truth." Kinney exhaled sharply. "We got into an argument," he admitted. "Brad wanted more. He was pressuring me. He wanted to tell people about us." "And you didn't want that," a detective interjected. Kinney shook his head violently. "No, I couldn't. My wife, my family, everything would have been ruined." "So you killed him?" "No," Kinney insisted. "I mean, I left. I stormed out. But when I left, he was alive." The detectives exchanged a glance. They had heard this kind of half-confession before, one that acknowledged guilt but avoided responsibility. "Then who killed him, David?" one detective asked. Kinney hesitated. He had no answer. The walls were closing in. While detectives continued pressing Kinney, forensic investigators were busy analyzing the crime scene. The gunshot wounds to Brad's head were executed with precision. 2 shots, close range. This wasn't a struggle. It was an execution. And then the most damning evidence surfaced. Kinney's fingerprints on shell casings found at the scene. When detectives confronted him with this evidence, Kinney's demeanor shifted. He lowered his head, his fingers gripping his knees. "That's not possible," he mumbled. "That's not possible." "But it is," the detective said. "You were there, and you pulled the trigger. Weren't you, David?" Kinney didn't respond. Silence filled the room, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him like an anchor. As the hours dragged on, Kinney's story shifted again. He started to admit things he hadn't before. "Yes, we fought. Yes, I was angry. Yes, I grabbed my gun." He paused. "But I swear, I didn't mean to." The detectives sat back, their work nearly complete. They had their confession, but there was still more to uncover. Why had Kinney truly killed Brad? Was it fear? Was it anger? Or was it something even darker? And most importantly, would he ever admit the full truth? The weight of his lies had become unbearable. After hours of interrogation, David Kinney was crumbling, his defenses shattering under the relentless pressure of the detectives. The room was silent, except for the low hum of the overhead fluorescent light. He had spent hours denying, twisting, and altering his version of events, but the truth had been closing in on him from the moment he set foot in that room. Kinney sat back in his chair, staring at the floor. The detectives remained motionless, giving him space to process the inevitable. Finally, Kinney exhaled, a long, shaky breath before he spoke again. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," he muttered. One of the detectives leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "Then tell us what happened, David. Tell us everything." Kinney wiped his hands over his face, struggling to find the words. "Brad and we were close, closer than anyone knew. We had been seeing each other for a while, but he wanted more. He was tired of being a secret. He wanted me to leave my wife." The detectives exchanged glances. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Kinney continued, his voice thick with emotion. "We argued about it for weeks. Every time I saw him, it was the same thing. He said he was tired of hiding. He threatened to tell my wife himself if I wouldn't do it. He said he loved me, but he couldn't live like this anymore." Kinney shook his head, his eyes unfocused, lost in the memory. "I begged him not to. I told him it would ruin everything. My marriage, my family, my entire life would be destroyed. He didn't care. He just kept pushing." The detective's voice remained steady. "So what happened that day, David?" Kinney's hands clenched into fists. "I went to his house that day to talk. I thought I could make him understand. I thought if I reasoned with him, he'd change his mind. He said it was over, that if I wasn't willing to be with him openly, he was done hiding. And then he told me he had already made up his mind, that my wife was going to find out one way or another." Kinney's voice trembled now. "I panicked. I begged him to reconsider, but he wouldn't listen. He told me I was a coward, that I never really loved him, that I was only using him, and then he turned his back on me." The room fell into silence. "And that's when you shot him," the detective finished. Kinney's face twisted in anguish. "I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't. I snapped. 1 second I was standing there, and the next I had the gun in my hand. I don't even remember pulling the trigger. But then he was on the ground, and there was blood everywhere." "You shot him twice, David," the detective reminded him. "Once wasn't enough." Kinney let out a choked sob. "The first shot, he fell, but he was still alive. He was looking up at me. I don't know if he was trying to say something or if he was just staring, but I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand seeing him like that. So I pulled the trigger again." "And then what?" the detective pressed. Kinney's breathing was ragged. I panicked. I had never felt fear like that before. I just stood there staring at his body. Then I realized what I had done. I knew I had to do something. So I staged it like a robbery. I moved some things around. I left the back door open. I thought maybe it would look like someone else did it. The detective nodded. "But you didn't take anything. There was no forced entry. It was too clean. That's why we knew it wasn't a random crime." Kinney rubbed his face, his body trembling. "I didn't know what else to do. I left. I drove around for hours, trying to think. I went home, acted normal, like nothing happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. And then when I found out the police were investigating, I knew it was only a matter of time." The detective leaned back, taking a deep breath. "So you went to the house with your wife and stepdaughter, pretending to find the body, trying to make it look like you were just as shocked as everyone else?" Kinney nodded. "I had to. I thought if I acted like I had just found him, no one would suspect me. But it didn't work. Did it?" He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You knew the whole time." "We knew something wasn't right," the detective admitted. "But now we know the whole truth." Kinney buried his face in his hands. "I didn't want to kill him. I loved him. I was scared. I was so scared." The detective stood. "Fear or not, David, Brad is dead, and now you have to face the consequences." The confession had sealed David Kinney's fate. His words were recorded, his guilt undeniable, and now the long road to justice had begun. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and those who had followed the tragic case from the moment Brad McGarry's body was discovered. The air inside was heavy, charged with anticipation and sorrow. As Kinney was led into the courtroom in his orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He had once been a family man, a trusted friend, but now he was just another accused killer standing trial for a crime of passion. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. Their goal was clear: to prove that David Kinney had murdered Brad McGarry in cold blood, driven by fear, desperation, and the desire to keep his double life a secret. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, pacing the floor with confident steps, "this is a case of deception, betrayal, and ultimately murder. The defendant, David Kinney, lived 2 lives, one as a devoted husband and father, the other as a secret lover to the victim, Brad McGarry. When that secret was threatened, he didn't choose honesty. He didn't choose integrity. He chose murder." The jury sat motionless, eyes locked on the prosecutor, absorbing every word. "We have his confession. We have the murder weapon. We have his fingerprints on the shell casings. But even before that, we had something else, the truth. And the truth has only one conclusion. David Kinney is guilty of murder." Kinney's defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. This was going to be an uphill battle. When the defense attorney stood to give his opening statement, his approach was cautious but firm. His goal was not to deny that Kinney had killed Brad McGarry. There was no escaping that fact. Instead, he aimed to paint Kinney as a man who had acted out of fear and emotional turmoil rather than cold-blooded intent. "This case is not as simple as the prosecution would have you believe," he said. "Yes, my client pulled the trigger. Yes, he was there that day. But this was not a calculated act of murder. It was a tragic, emotional outburst, a moment of fear, of panic, of desperation." He turned to the jury, his voice softer now. "David Kinney is not a monster. He is a man who made a terrible mistake. We ask you to consider not just what happened, but why it happened." The prosecution scoffed at this angle. To them, it was nothing more than an attempt to downplay premeditated murder. The trial moved swiftly as the prosecution brought forth witnesses to further solidify their case. Brad McGarry's friends testified about his growing frustration with being kept a secret, about the tension between him and Kinney in the weeks leading up to his death. Brad wasn't the type to keep quiet forever, one friend testified. He was tired of being hidden. He told me, one way or another, David's going to have to choose. The prosecution seized on that statement. And what happened just days later? The prosecutor asked. The friend's voice wavered. Brad was dead. Next came the forensic experts, detailing the trajectory of the bullets, the lack of defensive wounds, the placement of the body. Everything pointed to an execution-style killing, not a crime of passion. Then, the most damning witness of all took the stand, Kinney's own wife. She sat stiffly in the witness chair, her eyes red from exhaustion and grief. The betrayal was still fresh, the humiliation still raw. "Did you know your husband was having a relationship with Brad McGarry?" the prosecutor asked gently. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I had no idea." "And when you arrived at Brad McGarry's home with your husband, what did you see?" She swallowed hard. "David, he acted so shocked. He kept saying, 'Who would do this?' But now I know. Now I know he was lying the whole time." Her voice cracked, and she covered her mouth, sobbing quietly. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words suffocating. The jury watched her closely. If there had been any doubt left, it was fading fast. In a risky move, Kinney's defense attorney called him to testify. It was his last chance to salvage some shred of sympathy from the jury. Dressed in a suit, Kinney sat on the witness stand, hands folded in his lap. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "I never wanted to hurt Brad," he said. "I loved him. I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if anyone found out." The prosecutor wasted no time. "Afraid of losing your family, or afraid of being exposed?" Kinney hesitated. "Both." The prosecutor leaned in. "Mr. Kinney, you shot Brad McGarry twice. The first shot incapacitated him. He was still alive. You had a chance to stop. Why did you shoot him again?" Kinney's face crumbled. He had no answer. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "Because it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was murder." The jury remained stoic, but the conclusion was becoming clearer by the second. As the trial neared its end, both sides made their final pleas to the jury. The prosecution urged them to see Kinney for what he was, a man who chose his own secrets over another person's life. The defense, on the other hand, asked them to see him as a flawed man who made a devastating mistake. When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom remained tense, filled with whispered conversations and anxious glances. The weight of the trial, the emotions, the betrayal, it all hung in the air. David Kinney sat motionless, staring at the table before him. His fate was now in the hands of 12 strangers. The only question that remained was, would they see him as a desperate man who lost control, or as a murderer who had coldly silenced his secret lover? The jury's deliberation was long and intense. The court had emptied out for the evening, leaving only the remnants of the trial's emotional charge. David Kinney sat alone in the courtroom, his eyes unfocused, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. His defense had tried to paint him as a man overwhelmed by fear, but the prosecution's case had been unyielding. The question that had haunted him since the night of Brad McGarry's death still lingered in the air. Had he killed because of love, or because of a twisted fear of exposure? Outside the courtroom, reporters huddled together, speculating on the outcome. Some believed Kinney's defense would resonate with the jury, but others thought the weight of the evidence, the confession, the testimonies, the cold-blooded nature of the second shot would be too much to ignore. The jury returned to the courtroom on the 5th day of deliberation. The tension was palpable as the foreman stood to address the court. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the jury, unable to gauge their emotions. The moment of truth had arrived. The foreman's voice rang out, clear and solemn. "We, the jury, find the defendant, David Kinney, guilty of first-degree murder." The room erupted into a stunned silence. Kinney's face remained expressionless, though his hands trembled slightly. He had expected the verdict, but hearing it spoken aloud was a jarring reality. His defense attorney placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but there was no escaping the weight of his guilt. The prosecution stood with quiet triumph, knowing their case had been sealed. David Kinney was led away in handcuffs, his future uncertain. The family of Brad McGarry sat in the front row, some wiping away tears, others with stone-cold expressions. They had finally seen justice for their son, brother, and friend. The sentencing came weeks later, and David Kinney faced the judge with his head bowed, his fate now sealed. He had been convicted of first-degree murder, and the only remaining question was how long he would spend behind bars. The judge was unflinching as she addressed Kinney. "David Kinney, you took the life of a man who trusted you. You betrayed that trust, and in doing so, you destroyed not only the life of Brad McGarry, but also the lives of your own family. Your actions were driven by fear and deceit, but they were also premeditated. You shot Brad McGarry, and you took the opportunity to end his life, even after he was incapacitated." She paused, her eyes briefly flicking to the McGarry family in the front row. "For your crime, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A wave of relief swept over Brad's family, but it was a bittersweet victory. No sentence, no matter how harsh, could bring Brad back. They had waited years for this moment, but the grief of his loss would never be fully erased. The case of David Kinney and Brad McGarry had sent shockwaves through the community. It had been a story of hidden lives, deceit, and murder. For those who had known David as a husband, father, and friend, the revelation of his double life was a betrayal beyond measure. Many struggled to reconcile the man they had once admired with the man who had killed in cold blood. But for others, the case represented the destructive power of secrets, how the fear of being exposed could drive someone to do unspeakable things. The tragedy had left scars on all who had been involved, and it had served as a painful reminder of the consequences of living a life built on lies. David Kinney's family, too, had been torn apart by the events. His wife, though devastated by the revelation of his affair and the murder, had tried to rebuild her life, but the stain of her husband's actions would linger forever. She was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered family, all while grappling with the loss of the man she had once trusted. Brad McGarry, though gone, would not be forgotten. His story would be told, over and over again, as a reminder of the dangers of secrecy and the tragic consequences of betrayal. For those who had known him, Brad's memory lived on, not just as the victim of a murder, but as someone who had been loved and cherished, a man who had been caught in a web of deceit he had never deserved to be part of. In the years that followed, the case continued to haunt the community, lingering in conversations, in the quiet moments when people reflected on the choices that had been made. The murder of Brad McGarry was a tragedy, one that could have been avoided if only honesty and transparency had been embraced. But in the end, the truth had been revealed and justice had been served. As for David Kinney, his life was now confined to the prison walls he would never escape. The man who had once been a family man, a husband, and a friend was now nothing more than a shadow of the person he had once been. His guilt had been laid bare for all to see, and in the quiet darkness of his cell, he would have to confront the reality of his actions for the rest of his life. And so, the story of David Kinney and Brad McGarry came to its inevitable conclusion, a tale of love, betrayal, and the ultimate cost of secrets. It would be remembered as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how one man's fear and deception could lead to the irreversible loss of another life. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you found this story insightful, please subscribe and leave us a like. We would really appreciate that.